Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going, a weekly video games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube. Back with another episode of the Games Memo. This is the Games Memo for Friday, the 3rd of July, 2026. So without much further ado, let's get to it. So my apologies for the 1 hour-ish delay. This episode took me way longer to script out than I had anticipated. I have about 12 pages of stuff to go over today, so we will see if we can get through all of it. So let's get right with it started at the top of the rundown here with the first news story. The first wave of Steam machines has arrived at long last, but those without are left watching the waitlist. So we're leading off with this story because this is part of kind of this pile of content that I want to talk about today. That is about the heralding of a big shift in gaming hardware, but in general in the gaming landscape. And I say heralding, that's not to say that this is entirely new. There's always indications of change in the gaming landscape, but this is about a very specific and particular one, and I want to talk about the tenets of that this afternoon, and this is a key part of it. So the article that caught my eye is from Eurogamer. It's called Steam Machines Arrive, Unboxing Valve's Next Living Room PC by Ed Nightingale. In the piece, Ed describes how Valve is rolling out the first wave of Steam machines, and the company is using a lottery system to handle demand, aiming to avoid the scalper chaos that plagued previous console launches. So quoting from the top of the article, the first wave of Steam machines have arrived in the hands of eager early adopters, but while some are celebrating their new toy, others are left to stare at the waiting list. A flurry of celebratory pictures can be found on the Steam Machines subreddit, which has become a hub for moments of post-console unboxing revelry. Judging by this digital hub, Steam Machines started arriving Tuesday evening in Asia and a few other regions. In the days following, posts from Steam Machine buyers confirmed shipping confirmations were being received all around the world. There are now Steam machines in the UK, Australia, the Netherlands, and more. So some of the other kind of major topics around this that I wanted to kind of cover is, as a longtime observer of the industry, here's my personal perspective that I want to highlight. First, I kind of asked myself, what's the real story behind the Steam Machine launch? Like, why is it important? Why is it impactful? I don't think that this thing is going to sell particularly large and wide. Probably on the order of 3 to 7 million units. I said, hovering right around, to simplify, I'd say, 5 million. I was predicting that this thing was going to sell 9 million to 15 million, but with the price increases above and beyond what I expected, I think that expected sell through is less. But the real story behind this initial rollout is not just about the hardware. It's a sign that Valve is staking a claim on how we consume games in the living room, not just a desk. And while I think there's more caught up in this, it's not just about a thing in the living room. I actually honestly think that that's not as big a play as Valve and a lot of other people have talked about it. I think this is mostly about an alternative to gaming on Windows. And I think this is about primarily trying to convince other OEMs that this is a thing that is worthwhile for them to build, that there's a potential addressable market, that this sidesteps things like the cost of the Windows license to them to roll these things out, and also a lot of the relationships that go along with that. Microsoft's particularly strong-handed way of strong arming vendors that they deal with in terms of you want to keep that licensing cost down, then play by our rules. But I've commented before about how Windows 11 is kind of, in my opinion, in a terrible state as far as gaming. I mean, I've been on the PC scene for, 3 decades or more. If you go back all the way back to, the time when I started playing started doing PC gaming on 286 and 386 machines. But, there's never really been a poorer state of Windows than maybe Windows Vista. But things are pretty bad, right? And just in terms of what the overall experience is like. So I think this is primarily about getting this thing out, getting this proof of concept out, showing that people are interested in it, showing that people are interested in having an alternative to Windows, and proving to OEMs, like I said, that that the viability is there, that the stability of the operating system is there, and that the support that will come from Valve, right? I mean, the big maturation, the big evolution that Valve has to make is they have to firmly step into the arena of being someone who oversees a Linux distribution, right? And so that has to kind of be proven. But the other thing that's important here, I think, is just the case study that's being set by the lottery system. It's because Valve is trying to prevent scalpers and bought something that we saw plague last gen pre-orders, or this gen pre-orders rather. As a consumer, to me, this matters even more because cost is rising, and a lot of us next time around are only going to be able to afford one platform. So I talked a little bit before about how in this generation, particularly amongst content creators, we kind of thump our chests and and puff them out and talk about how we are a multi-platform gamer. I don't think you're going to see as many people being able to do that next time, at least definitely not at the consumer level. And I think a lot of content creators aren't going to be able to do that as well. I think we're going to have to make choices. And we'll talk a little bit at the end, maybe about like some of what my rubrics that I've been coming up with about like where, depending on where prices land, like what am I going to engage in? But the critical thing is that like, because we're making like, so again, in one of my scenarios, I foresee myself not playing on consoles at all, but definitely potentially only playing on one, right? And so one of my thumb rules that's been established is I'm not going to pay more than $750 for a console. And consoles need to be down at $650 or below for me to continue to be I'd say multi-platform gamer, but really what I'm saying is, both an Xbox and a PlayStation gamer on console. If they go above $650, then I'm not buying two, which means between $650 and $750, I start getting into the land where I'm only joining one from console. And so, and other people I think are going to be even more selective, right? So when we talk about getting down to that level of down select, things become much more critical, right? Like, at the beginning of this generation, I got a Series S because it's what was available. I wasn't really wrapped around the axle about that down select, right? I was like, I'll just grab it. I can replace, at that time we were at prices where like, I can take this thing, I can trade it in, I can bump up to a Series X, right? Those things were in the realm of feasibility. Those types of scenarios start to go away in the realm of prices rising in the way that they are. And so that down select is going to be much more critical. And I think that consumer experience of sourcing that console is going to be more critical. That down selection process, choosing that one device, has never been more critical than it's going to be next time around. When you're a retailer, and I had a lot of angst for the fact that some of the biggest purveyors of these consoles were Amazon and then Microsoft, right, with its selling of its Xbox SKUs directly from the platform vendor. And I'm like, you guys are literally the two biggest CSPs, two biggest cloud service providers on the planet. I know that there is a way for you to shard your storefront, for you to implement additional load balancers, put the right types of network isolation in place so that you can maintain throughput and manage the workload, put people in a queue and allow them to purchase this device without all of the chicanery and foolishness that we had to go through to procure them. And I'm like, and if it can't be like if anyone should be able to do it, you two guys can. And both the Amazon experience and the Microsoft storefront experience were horrible. I'm like, there's kind of no excuse for this. Like if I know how to do this from my experience right in cloud trading as a cloud architect, I'm like, then you guys who own and manage these platforms definitely should know how to do it. So like, I didn't get it. Like, I feel like we can't do this. Like, I think it was Nintendo who did a good job, at least with one of the options variants that they were looking at with the Nintendo Switch 2, where they were like, you have to request right to be in the reservation queue. We have to look at you, look at your account, look at your validity of, does this person actually play games? Like, is there traceability that this person is actually in the Nintendo ecosystem? We have to make sure, like in the regular world, not connected to games, we call this identity proofing, right? And so these are the things that, like, Experian, and some other corporations do to establish that you are who you are. A little less invasive than that. Nintendo wasn't going back and looking at, did you own a car in the state of Ohio in the years, 2005 through 2009. So, but they did some degree of, essentially the same thing as identity proofing. And so I think those things are good. I think any and all of these approaches to like minimizing this impact of scalpers and bots needs to occur. And again, as we start to approach getting into a generation where people are only going to have one of these things, those things become more important. So stick with me on this channel. This is a news story that we will continue to follow in terms of like consumer procurement of these critical, what are becoming now these critical and limited availability devices. And I say that in terms of they have been critical. They've had limited availability before, but like I said, because the prices are rising and people are going to have, be going for one device, it's going to become that much more of an issue. If you're a retailer, right, like, so for instance, when I got my Series S from Amazon, I'm going to go back to I'm going to potentially go back to Amazon for a PlayStation, right? Or for some other console if you're, Best Buy or whatever. But next time around, people are going to be buying less of these things. So if you are a retailer and you whiff on capturing a customer their first time around, they're going to move on. They're going to find another retailer, another source chain to procure this thing through, and they're not coming back to buy like a different brand of console because they're only going to be able to afford one. So I just think it's becoming a more critical thing to look at. Ramon has joined the chat. I appreciate you, Ramon. Hey, yo, I didn't know you were on. I can listen while I drive to go get some nice vegan brunch. That sounds awesome. I have to talk to you about this notion I have for a roadside, I say it's not really a roadside, but for either a roadside or a strategically located vegan burrito shop called Dad's Famous Foods. This has been an idea that's been percolating for a very long time. Probably will never be executed, but it's a nice daydream. So I want to go on and talk about the second news story. Union workers establish hardship fund to support devs impacted by layoffs. This news story over on Game Developer by Chris Kerr. According to I don't know why I thought this was by somebody else. Okay, according to a report by Chris Kerr on GameDevelopers.com, union workers have established a hardship fund to support game developers impacted by layoffs. These layoffs are coming at a tough time with widespread restructuring across the industry, and this fund aims to provide a financial safety net for those left unemployed. Quoting from the top of the article, union members at United Video Game Workers CWA, UVW-CWA, have established the Game Worker Hardship Fund to provide a financial lifeline to struggling developers impacted by layoffs. The fund will support game workers across the United States and Canada who have lost their jobs or been impacted in other ways as a result of the wave of job cuts that has swept across the video game industry in recent years. Eligible applicants can request either a small cash sum of up to $1,000 or a larger amount ranging from $1,000 to $5,000. Funds can be requested for a range of reasons, including for basic life expenses such as groceries, medical bills, and rent. So again, as a longtime observer of the industry, I wasn't necessarily surprised, but I did see this as a meaningful evolution in what's going on with unions in the tech space, in the knowledge worker space. As I've often said, that unions in the tech and knowledge worker space don't stop layoffs. They can't. But what they can do, as we're seeing here, is they can mitigate the damage by negotiating better severance packages and now by setting up these safety nets. This is all happening as layoffs hit the industry hard, particularly at Xbox. And here's why that's so crucial. There's a staggering number of unfilled software engineering jobs out there. In the US alone, more than 1 million software development roles are unfilled, and globally, by 2025, that number could reach 4 million. This shortage is a huge opportunity for developers who are being laid off now. So my advice to game developers is to be very career aware. I've spent 30 years mentoring engineers, and I always stress that you need to be intentional. You need to be deliberate. You need to be career aware, job aware. You need to understand the culture of the corporation at which you work if you work in a very large organization. You need to be job aware, skill aware. You need to understand where gluts are. You need to understand where trends are moving. The main thing you need to understand is you need to not bank that you're going to have a manager who is going to mentor you and coach you through that. You need to seek that person out. They need not necessarily be in your chain of command. And or you need to go about acquiring that set of sensibilities yourself. If your environment is toxic, and what I mean by that is your career space, like I've existed in career tracks where just culturally, right, that domain specialty is one that's toxic. It's full of a bunch of one-upsmanship. It has certain personality, behavioral tendencies that fill the space. You need to recognize if that's where you are. If you're not valued, don't stay just because you think gaming is your only option. I've had this discussion with a few developers, and I kind of always come back to my assessment being that there's this kind of rock star mentality, right? That there's this aspirational hope. And I'm not saying you shouldn't aspire to things, but there's this aspirational hope that, the NBA effect, right? That 1 out of 10 of them is going to be Todd Howard, right? And you're going to be standing on a stage in a leather jacket talking about your game. But I think the acknowledgement needs to be made that some 0 point something, fractional percentage of people are going to ascend to that point in the industry. So if you're not valued, don't just stay because you think gaming is your only option. If you're not valued, there are millions of open tech jobs outside of gaming, roles where you can earn higher salaries, enjoy better work-life balance, and be valued for your skills. You may not reach that absolute pinnacle of top gaming talent. I talk about in the gaming industry how there are these sharpshooters, these snipers, these mercenaries, right? This is this upper crust band of, I don't know, maybe less than 100 people who are consistently the people who are called in, like retired spec ops people get called in by the CIA, right? They're like, there are these people who get called in and roped in to be closers on big AAA projects, right? In the final year or 2 years, and they are deliberately not employed full-time as full-time salaried employees with a single company, because being on that mercenary payroll, right, it allows them to kind of command whatever salary they ask for. So you're probably not going to hit that, but you will hit higher salary bands faster. So you may not hit that pinnacle, but you're probably going to get into the thick part of kind of the earnings potential that you want sooner than you may get to in the gaming industry. So at any rate, be savvy, know your career path, understand your worth, and don't be afraid to explore. Again, stick with me. I'll be following this story as well as others about unions and worker relationships, worker society, worker environments, worker protection. In the space, I've covered lots of stories about like the union actions at Ubisoft and at Rockstar, at Activision, at Bethesda, other Xbox studios. So this is a topic we will be keeping up with. Let's move on to the third news story. I'm going to take a quick break. Quite parched today. It's temperatures have been in excess of 100 here, so it's very easy to get dried out and dehydrated. Next news story: Onimusha Way of the Sword will launch 3 weeks earlier. This news story over on Game Informer by Marcus Stewart. Quoting from the top of the article, September, particularly its last week, is packed with big releases, and Capcom has seemingly recognized this by adjusting the release date for Onimusha Way of the Sword. The game was set to launch on September 25th, but has been moved up to release during the first week of the month. Onimusha Way of the Sword will now launch on September 4th through the 21st. It will now launch on September 4th, 21 days earlier than planned, although the game still rubs shoulders with The Blood of Dawnwalker, which arrives on September 3rd. That's probably better than when it was launching one day after Control Resonant and Silent Hill Townfall. I think up against Blood of the Dawnwalker, you have an IP, I think, that still resonates a bit within memory, more so than a entirely brand new IP. Whereas, deploying later when it was planned, it was up against Control Resonant, which, that IP doesn't have as much longevity, but I think it betters its competitive stance by having greater recency, and people just love Control. And Silent Hill, while it also has recency because it's had more recent titles that have come out. We played Onimusha Way of the Sword on 2 occasions and have been impressed with its modernized take on the series' signature swordplay. You can read our first hands, blah, 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 blah. Okay, and I think there's a demo out. I have not played the demo, so unfortunately I can't speak from that perspective. So when I saw that Onimusha Way of the Sword is now launching 3 weeks earlier, moving from September 25th to September 4th. Do I have that right? Because I misread that the first round. Yes, September 4th. I didn't have a huge surprise reaction, but I immediately thought about how strong Capcom has been this year. They might just deserve the title of Publisher of the Year because they've really overcome this hurdle with RE Engine. And there's a lot of noise and buzz about, Publisher of the Year. I don't actually really know what that means. I don't think there's a trophy or anything that goes out on an award show to Publisher of the Year. It is mostly tightly coupled to kind of this grassroots thing where, Metacritic declares a Publisher of the Year by taking the review scores of all the games that Publisher has put out and crunching those metrics and ranking them, which I don't really necessarily agree with as proof that somebody is Publisher of the Year. Very many times what we have seen is the games that a publisher puts out, when you look at them in aggregate, they're kind of layups, right? They are games in very super niche categories where, like, I hate to say it, but maybe it was easier for them to get an 87 or a 92 or whatever. But you could put out 10 indie titles, right, that all get 85s, and have that stacked up against a bunch of AAA titles that maybe provide greater production value or more graphically performant or whatever, and you just still be Publisher of the Year. So I don't know. I don't put that much weight in it, but it's a good, neat little talking thing for the gaming community. But anyway, back to the struggles with RE Engine. For a long time, the issue was that nothing outside of Resident Evil ran well on RE Engine. RE Engine was really great for RE, not much else. Monster Hunter Wilds was a prime example, AAA price, but it launched with technical problems and never really recovered. It has recovered a little bit. I just don't think it's still not fully recovered. Dragon's Dogma 2 was even worse, and that is still a mess. Also a mess at launch and still not fixed. But this year they turned it around. The full 2026 lineup includes Resident Evil 7 Gold Edition, Resident Evil Requiem, Resident Evil Village Gold Edition, Monster Hunter Stories 3, which does run on RE Engine, Monster Hunter Stories 3 Twisted Reflection, Mega Man Star Force Legacy Collection, Pragmata, and Devil May Cry 5 Devil Hunter Edition. I'm not absolutely certain all of these that run on the RE Engine. So I do know the ones that do run on RE Engine, but there's a few that I'm like, the Mega Man thing and Devil and DMC. I'm not absolutely certain those run on RE Engine, but the vast majority of the rest of those do run on RE Engine, in particular Pragmata, Monster Hunter Stories 3, and obviously Resident Evil Requiem. So the majority do, and they're all performant, showing that Capcom has really defeated this monster, this beast that they've been wrestling with for the last few years. So when they move Onimusha up, what that tells me is that the game is done. They're pretty much just in polish now. And it comes as Capcom is really firing on all cylinders. September is just crazy crowded because everyone's dodging GTA. But honestly, I don't think consumers needed that long. It's kind of insane what has gone down. Look, the way people get paid, where you have a large bulk of people who get paid on the 1st and the 15th of the month, means, at least here culturally in America, nobody's earmarking $80 for GTA until they get paid on November 15th. So quite honestly, you could launch your game anytime between September, October, and November 1st, the November 1st payday, which really takes you to November 14th, and you should be fine. People will find money to buy your game. So pay cycles mean people, so like I said, honestly, I don't think consumers need that long. Pay cycles mean people will spend in mid-November. all the way up through mid-November before they're worried about GTA 6. So it's bold for them to move it up, but I think Capcom knows exactly what it's doing, trusting both their game and their audience, and it can really pay off. I also think there will be plenty of time to put your game out after GTA 6. You may have to do some, maneuver through some chicanes because they're going to put out the single player game GTA 6 because that's what they're calling it, that it's a single player experience. And then at some point later, they're going to deploy the online version. I've heard lots of different prognostications of that. I tend to believe that it's going to be somewhere aligned to what they've done in the past, which means it could drop 2 weeks later. It could drop a month later. I've heard some people theorize that it could be a year later because of, not just the fact that it's huge and they have to deploy it, but that, there's a big get from having the players on PC being able to join in immediately. But also the fact that they're going to be exposed. We're going to talk about this today. They're going to be exposed to the same effect that we see on the consoles, where we talk about how the consoles in this generation have experienced a lot more sluggishness of people being willing to upgrade from last gen to this gen. They're going to have kind of a similar analogous problem in that they've got tons of people on GTA 5 Online. Quite honestly, I don't know. I know this is bullish. This is just kind of my approach. I think because, I'm heavy in the technology space. But quite honestly, I would put up GTA 6 Online or whatever they're going to call it now. And I would take GTA 5 Online off, because as long as people still have that pacifier, there are going to be people who choose to keep playing GTA 5 Online and aren't going to move over. Unless they have some master transition plan of merging the populations or migrating people, mandatorily. We kind of saw this a little bit with, Destiny 2 in some ways. It's not exactly the same thing from a technical perspective, but just from a user account perspective, it is, right? Where, you were on Destiny 2 and you had, I guess you had an Activision account, or maybe, I think maybe I was actually in Destiny 2 from Battle.net. And then there was a point where you were I think you were forcibly migrated over. Maybe you had to do some manual intervention, but I think a lot of it was also forced. I think you were forcibly migrated over to a Destiny 2 account that was not like an Activision Battle.net account. I'm not exactly sure. But yeah, some level of forced migration might also be in the plan, or at least like I said, that's what I would do. If people are sluggish moving over, I would just not give them the option of not moving over. So let's get into the big topic, because this is going to take a long time. And I'm going to take another break to take a quick swig. Okay, here we go. Game industry reacts to PlayStation ending physical media. This news story over on Game Rant, at least the first one, and I may go through all the news stories up and kind of front load that and then go through all the assessment because it's very long and maybe torturous. We'll see. Game industry reacts to PlayStation ending physical media. Like I said, over on Game Rant by Adrian Morales. The news that PlayStation is ceasing physical disc production in 2028 has not only left fans shocked, but has also prompted developers to voice their concerns and disappointment at the announcement. PlayStation has been making significant changes to its business strategy lately, leaving many fans upset with the direction the company is taking. As the gaming industry continues to navigate difficult times, PlayStation has chosen to cut what many consider a core part of the gaming experience, physical discs. On July 1st, 2026, PlayStation announced that it would stop producing physical game discs in 2028, leaving the platform digital only. Fans have been quick to voice their dissatisfaction with the matter, and now developers, big and small, are joining in. Across Twitter, developers from studios including Larian Studios, the studio behind Baldur's Gate 3, and Lost in Cult, the studio behind Terraria, have posted about how much physical media means to them and how PlayStation's decision to cut disc sales negatively affects the industry. Larian's publishing director, Michael Dallas, has said he is genuinely heartbroken while conceding that the physical version of Baldur's Gate 3 may have been stupidly expensive to produce, but at least it made people happy. So this is one of the first things we should pick up on, right? Like, people's emotions versus the objective quantification of what it took to make the business go, right? Meanwhile, Bill Basso of Animal Well Acclaim says he is upset he will never release another physical game on PlayStation, citing a physical release as a huge motivator for completing the game. It's actually kind of interesting. I didn't even think about it as I was scripting this out, but I listened to the Game Business Show episode this week, which had an interview of, I can't remember his name right off the top of my head, but he was a long, I think his name is Jason something or other. He's a long time veteran at BioWare, and has gone on to do all sorts of things all over the industry. Maybe Ruben, but I don't think I need to read any more from that story. So let me look at the Game Business Show. But he talked about his start in the industry and how one of the experiences he had was they made a game for EA, and they made it right on the eve of Madden, the first Madden, and so Naughty Dog founder Jason Rubin. We're not gonna play this, but and he mentioned how they made a game, and EA had originally said they were gonna make, were they on discs or cartridge? They were on cartridges at the time. And he mentioned how they were going to make the agreement was for them to make 60,000 more cartridges at the time. But Madden took off and sold like hotcakes. And so EA made the decision, hey, we're not actually going to make your 60,000 cartridges because it costs us, and we're going to take the capital that would require us to put out those 60,000 cartridges and make 60,000 more Madden cartridges. And obviously he was heartbroken at the time as well. But again, that is a thing that goes back to where you have this convergence and often friction and this butting up against of how, people may feel. In this game, I can't remember what it's called, that Jason Rubin had made, and his partner at the time was a good game, right? But it just bumped up against the hard, cold reality of Madden, which again, many people feel is a soulless, corporate, capitalistic piece of content that does not have the artistic flavor of, other properties on the landscape. And I get that. But if it sells like incredibly well, right, these are the choices that wind up being made. The other news story that is closely associated with the remainder of everything I want to go through is this news story. The first one is this one over on GameIndustry.biz. Sony to discontinue physical discs for new games launching on PlayStation consoles from January 2028. Sony will discontinue physical disc production for new games releasing on PlayStation consoles starting January 2028. The company stated the decision is in response to shifting trends in consumer preference and the broader entertainment industry as it transitions from physical to digital formats. Starting January 2028, games will be available only in digital format through the PlayStation Store and other retailers. This change does not affect titles released or launching on disc before that date. This is a natural direction for Sony Interactive Entertainment to adapt to consumer trends as the general preference for digital media significantly outpaces physical discs. This transition will enable us to align more closely with how most of our community prefers to access and play games today. As reported by GameFile, Sony recorded that nearly 4 in 5 purchases of full games on PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 were digital over the past financial year. Yeah, so this is one of the things, one of the numbers, right? So a large part of this dynamic of what's been going on in the discussion this week is there are different numbers that come out. They have different interpretations. Admittedly, I think people interpret the numbers as best suits, right, their argument. But what I will say, and one of the key differences, points of contention, has been this whole thing about what numbers include microtransactions and what don't. This number does not include microtransactions. It says right here, 4 and 5 purchases of full games. And when that terminology is used in the trade space in terms of revenue generation of games, full games, those are the games. Those are not microtransactions. So 4 out of 5 purchases of full games on PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 were digital. Now, there's no ascribement there whether or not those were $70 games or $30 games, or whether there's like a more atomic granular difference between, maybe $70 games sell more at retail, right? In physical format at brick and mortar shops than digital does. I don't know. But we'll talk a little bit about like what the data means and, why it matters or doesn't matter. And the final news story that's kind of caught up in this is also over on GameIndustry.biz. Xbox is reportedly considering dropping disk drives as it tests a new feature that lets players digitize physical games. This is particularly exciting. Exciting in some ways, depending on what the process is. Like, I don't need to look. I went through digitizing my music collection and digitizing my movies. I don't personally need this. I just would rather you just give me I prove to you that I have the disc, and then you give me credit, right, for a license token or whatever. I don't need to be going through a bunch of herky jerky to try and get credit for the games that I own physically. Digital entitlement will be revoked if the game is shared or sold. A new report now claims Xbox, like PlayStation, is set to drop the disc drive. Earlier today, Sony confirmed plans to discontinue physical discs for new games launching on PlayStation consoles from January 2028, intimating that its next console could ship without a disc drive. Additional reporting by Windows Central now claims that, which I don't find particularly reliable, but now claims that Microsoft's next generation console, codenamed Project Helix, could similarly ship without a disc drive. Further reporting by The Verge, who I don't particularly care for Tom Warren, but I do put a little more gravitas on when he reports something than I do Windows Central. Further reporting by The Verge has also picked up rumors from earlier in the year suggesting Xbox has been testing a new feature that would permit players to digitize their existing physical game collection, enabling them to remain playable on disc-less devices. The discs will reportedly still work once they've been digitized, and while it's thought access to the digital version will be revoked if you loan or sell the disc to someone else, the precise permission and how the feature will work are still unclear. So the main point of this article is that, hey, there are indications and warning that Xbox may also be planning on joining PlayStation in this all-digital future, although by different paths. So let's talk a little bit about, my assessment of what all this means. And we're probably going to go around all over the places. I have a ton of stuff scripted, but not necessarily everything. And let me take another quick break. So the first thing that this really caused me to consider is the timing. Why? Like, I was actually, quite honestly, most people are not, congratulatory towards PlayStation about this announcement, but I actually found it pretty remarkable that PlayStation is giving people an 18 months heads up. That to me is unprecedented. I would have normally expected this type of announcement to come out in like December of 2027, like right around the Game Awards show or something like that. Limited amount of time of heads up, limited amount of time to deal with the vitriol, right, and the pushback. So I actually think it's pretty, profound that they're giving you an 18 months heads up. And of course, I think we might want to spend some time considering about why is that. And I still don't necessarily know the why, but the convergence that I wonder is like, are they telegraphing when, like, I think January 2028, either the PlayStation 6 has to be out or have launched. Maybe it's a holiday 2027 launch, or at a minimum, by then I think we know, right, when that the PlayStation 6 is coming, and maybe we have something like it's a 2028 date. I definitely think it is a long heads up and a long telegraph, and that's going to be conjoined with some level of announcement from them about the PlayStation 6 and the heralding of the next generation, because A lot of people, including Ramon, who I think is still listening while he's driving, I think mentioned last night on Damage Per Second on DPS podcast with Slow Mo and Forte that this would have been a more palatable pill to palatable pill to swallow, if it was conjoined with the notion of the beginning of the next generation, right? We kind of have this connotative thing where if something shifts at the beginning of the next generation, we tend to accommodate that change more because we expect some things to shift, right? We tend to accommodate that better than if we hear about something like mid-generation. And so maybe the console obviously isn't announced yet, and maybe it's too early to kind of tip their hand, but this is a thing. And I think the other reason you put this out is because it's not just for consumers, but you're also making sure that developers know that this isn't going to be a thing in 2028, but in particularly, maybe telegraphing to them this isn't going to be a thing on the next generation console as well. So like I said, the only thing with the timing that the news story caused me to think about is that seems like there's a plausible connection to that kind of telegraphing when we should expect the PlayStation 6, or at least by then we should be aware of when it's going to drop. I do, another big question going around is like, was this inevitable? Yeah, I do think there's an inevitability-ness to this, right? I think it is known and it should be understood that at some point consoles were going all digital. That's not a question. Everything has, even to the extent where if you look at smartphones, right, going all digital, they don't even include, Android phones don't even include removable storage, right? Expandable storage anymore, right? It's all on phone. And so even my point being, even at the physical level, right, we've even moved towards not having physical separation or logical separation of even storage on smartphones, right? It's all gone to all digital and everything being housed within the device, right, as a unitary prospect. And so this is kind of an analog to that or an extension of it. Music has gone in that direction. Video has gone in this direction, and games have been, PC moved this direction 20 years ago. All of our books have moved in that direction and made this transition. So I think the main thing that people have been hanging themselves up on is that, yes, in terms of like why they're calling out the differences that is that, hey, but there are still physical, I've done this all day because I use the word fiscal so much. I've been saying fiscal. I've been pronouncing it with no differentiation between fiscal and physical. So I am talking about physical variants of media still being produced. So like, yes, we largely made a transition to a largely digital distribution modality for books, but you could still obviously go buy paper books. Ditto for movies, right? The vast majority of movies at scale and television shows are distributed digitally via streaming, or even digitally, right? If you make them, if you make purchases of them. So a lot of people are screaming bloody murder because you can still buy physical versions of this, but what we are not applying, right, in that same reasoning is, yes, but individual vendors have stopped, right? Individual vendors have done exactly what PlayStation is doing. There are individual storage vendors who stopped producing spinning hard drives, and they only make SSDs now. So there are individual corporations, businesses, or whatever that have exited the supply chain of a space, of a thing in a certain format, in a certain containerization, and that is what PlayStation is doing here. Like I said, individual vendors have chosen to leave that space, of the physical space. So there's a lot of putting it on PlayStation as if the choice has been removed, but the choice hasn't been removed. The choice has been removed from a particular platform. But at a market scale or an industry scale, there are absolutely options to participate in physical media for video games. Now that presents you a choice and an option. If you are wanting to play specifically on the PlayStation platform, then yeah, that option has been removed. And what that means for you as a decision maker, because my emphasis on the gaming community this week is it is time to make decisions and choices, as I always say, and not spend as much time wallowing in the rearview mirror trying to figure out why a thing has happened. This thing has happened and it's not being reversed. So get about the business of making decisions and figuring out your own way forward. So what that means on you as a decision maker, which is what I said consumers should be focused on, less so on kind of Monday morning quarterbacking and trying to Sherlock why PlayStation did this, then your focus should be on where can I go play games where I can access them via physical media? PlayStation is a vendor in the space, and each vendor has an option to choose to run their business as they see fit. It's really kind of strange to me how in the gaming community we behave as if all vendors are supposed to be the same, or as if all vendors are held by some magical tethering symbiotic rubric, as if it's a religious or Christian dogma, right, that they all have to ascribe to, and that's not the case. We had this like contention when the Xbox guys, were running around a couple of years ago, last year, actually probably a few weeks ago, asserting that all games should be published on all platforms, right? That's the only way to make money. Games need to be free. Right now, all of a sudden, they're all supportive of the notion of exclusives, which is kind of crazy to me as well and hypocritical, but I digress. But there's so many arguments in the space that like, hey, everybody needs to do the same. No, they don't need all to do the same thing. That is the point of competition. And I've talked about this even when I've talked about like the operating system and going back to the exclusivity model. In the PC space, in the operating system space, we have three different models. We have walled garden, right? So we have Apple, Mac OS, iOS. We have, what's the term that I always use? We have proprietary but licensed. So we have Windows, even to a certain extent that you can license Windows and then modify it to a certain extent in terms of how it's deployed. This is how we get to Windows being used for different purposes, like on cash registers and in automation and machine automation and industry automation, and in different formats, right? It's proprietary, but it's licensed, right? So you can do things with it, but you have to pay that license to get access to it. And it's proprietary, it's not open sourced. Because as you guys have heard me before, I get very tired of people referring to Windows as open. Windows is not open. Microsoft requires you to pay for access to Windows. Then we do have true open source, right? We have Linux. We have a publicly available, open sourced, set of code that anybody can go download and make modifications to it and distribute it however you see fit. So everybody in the gaming industry, everybody in the console space does not need to do the same thing. That's not how business works. It's definitely not the way business works in capitalism. One of the most pertinent things that this kind of harkens to me is when Apple pulled the headphone jack from the iPhone. People flipped out because they were acting as if the choice had been removed from them. But as the rest of the market really responded, this is another part of how social media representation of participants on the market does not reflect the market at scale. The choice was not being removed. The headphone jack still existed on Android phones. You could go get it. When Android phones removed the headphone jack, that was because what they saw in the market response was nobody gave a shit about the headphone jack. Okay, I'm saying that a bit as an extreme. But my point is that a particular vendor, a particular platform removed a choice. And then what the market telemetry showed was that by removing that choice, people didn't really care. People didn't care at scale the way people asserted or thought or claimed they did. And when the rest of the industry saw that removing that choice in air quotes was not that big of a deal, then they all moved in that same direction because the people that it offended were determined to not be that many people. I'm not saying that that's how this will play out, but I'm saying that is the cascading effect, right? Number one, the choice is not being removed. A platform vendor has decided how to run their business. Your choice as a consumer is if you still insist on wanting physical media. I mean, quite honestly, the choices leave the PlayStation ecosystem because PlayStation's not providing you as a supplier with what you want. That is why we have multiple suppliers on the market. So if you want physical, then go to a gaming platform that participates and provides physical media. But if the rest of the industry moves in a direction that removes physical media as a choice, it is probably because there's a market response that's seen that says people don't care that much. So if there's this mass exodus from the PlayStation ecosystem, then that will mean a thing. But if there's not, that means that people actually weren't as bothered by the removal of physical media as we have all worked ourselves up to believe that there's going to be. So like I said, social media flipped out because Apple was pulling the headphone jack. But the way the market responded at scale in aggregate was not to flip out because the headphone jack had been pulled. They continued to buy iPhones, and they continued to buy iPhones. Eventually, it took a long time, actually at scale, and we're going to talk about growth a little bit in making this choice. they continued to buy iPhones at a scale that eventually exceeded Android phones. And for a very, very long time in the smartphone space, even though iPhones gained the most revenue, they did not sell to the largest install base. People bought more Android phones, and that was a lot because Android phones were, basically given away. Quite frankly, the reason a lot of those Android vendors went away is because they were actually not running profitable businesses. We talk about Xbox now putting 3 cents in its pocket for every $1 of goods that it sells. And those Android makers were actually losing money, right? With the prayer and the hope that they would make money back up on services, or quite honestly, through data collection, right, of the people that were using their phones. And that turned out to not be the case. And a lot of them had to wind up exiting space. Dried Chisel came by. Ramon, I don't know why you're, no, I'm not tagged in as a mod. I don't know why you're, it says that I am. I don't know. Ramon, maybe you retracted your message. So, but thanks, Dried Chisel, for swinging by. I appreciate it. So I go on and I talk a lot about, MacBooks that went to all USB, even though they were putting lightning ports on iPhones. And we won't get into that. We'll skip that part of the script. So anyway, there's a lot of outrage right now because, a singular vendor has done a thing without acknowledging the fact that the way supply and demand works is that if your needs are not fulfilled on one platform, you can go to another platform. So this to me is the shoe drop that I'm waiting to see. There's a lot of claiming and insistence that people are going to leave and exit the PlayStation ecosystem. I hope that they do, because as I constantly contend, that is the only way that any legitimate signal, any legitimate telemetry is sent back to the vendor that they've done something to displease you. So anyway, we act outraged because, a single vendor has done a thing without acknowledging the fact that the way supply and demand works is that if your needs are not fulfilled, so that doesn't necessarily make Sony or PlayStation evil for electing to run their business as they effectively think they need to. Again, there's a lot of this ascribement of value-oriented terms to corporations. And to me, that again, corporations are inanimate objects. They are organizations. In a capitalist system and on a capital economy, they are driven and motivated by one thing: to make profit. As soon as you go beyond being a mom and pop shop and, at most having aspirations to become a local chain, again, in air quotes for audio listeners, by having a grand total of 2 locations, right, in small town USA, once you pass beyond that, you are motivated by one thing: to make profit. And that obviously exponentially increases when you become an investor-owned property. So there's lots of this thing about they're evil. They're not evil. You can't ascribe a moral rubric, right, to a non-animate entity. That's just not the way it works. You don't call a couch evil, right? Or a pack of lions evil, right? They may eat people, but that doesn't make them evil. They have to make decisions on how they're going to run their business. And remember, we're sailing into a point where the gaming industry is becoming increasingly and incredibly difficult. It's becoming incredibly difficult to navigate and is way more risk, right? It's already a heavily risk-prone industry. And now it's being presented with even greater risk at the notion of toppling over because of the behavior of consumers, right? The business is trying to figure out how to run itself in the face of consumer behaviors that are not mapping to traditional paradigms and are presenting them challenges. You have Xbox, which is running at a 3% profit margin, which for any other business would be teetering on the brink of insolvency. So these are the challenges facing, and we put a lot of deference on the PlayStation. The optimistic outlook is you look at PlayStation and you say, well, they're running at 12 to 15% profit, so that's 5 times healthier than Xbox. But the reality is they're putting 15 cents in their pocket at best, right, for every dollar of goods that they sell. So there's not a ton of cushion between them and being where Xbox is, quite honestly. There are other financial factors, right, and market factors to look at where I could proclaim that PlayStation is running a healthier business right now. But on the simple metric of profit margin, it's not like it's worlds different from where Xbox is. And it is a day and one decision away, right, from being right in their spot. So again, that is a risk-based assessment, not a company performance assessment. So if PlayStation feels that the best financial thing for them is to stop participating in physical, I think that's fully their choice. And again, that's not me saying that I agree with it. That is me acknowledging that they are a business. They are run by a board of directors. They are owned by, they are invested in by shareholders. And I can't expect that business to do what I want to do right on a particular given Sunday. So, and then what consumers have to decide on the free exchange barter system of the capitalist market, right? Which is how I always kind of frame what the relationship is between supplier and buyer. So that's the thing that I always point to. The consumers, need to decide if they want to go take their business elsewhere, and they can articulate that all they want to. I personally am kind of over the wailing and gnashing of teeth and the whinging about being unhappy with PlayStation. When you become unhappy with a vendor, that is when you need to do the due diligence and take responsibility for yourself and determine where you're going to go shop. Because the only thing that these corporations care about, right, is, the only thing that's pertinent is that they don't care about the whining and the whinging on social media. They care about where the spend is. And so over a very long career and time period, right, as a consumer technologist, as a gamer, I have been through this, right? I have been through the time periods where things have been removed from me. I have been through the time, like, I always point back to Windows Phone, right? But, other products, I lived through, Sega going away and that choice being removed. The market crash of 1983, which I lived through because I was an active paying participant on the gaming market at the time. All of these times when like platforms go away, in the PC space, disk-based stuff went away. The difference then, and I think a lot of the difference in response, is that there wasn't a singular platform owner to point to, right? We couldn't, what were we going to do? Say all 22 publishers in the PC gaming space were all evil for taking discs away. And I'm sure some people did at the time, but by the same token, we also didn't have the heated crucible of social media, right, to centrifuge that ill sentiment, right, and swirl it around at 95 RPM, right, and cause it to gain velocity and like take off on the trajectory it has, which is about like the dynamic wasn't different, but just the slurry and what I think is like an evil environment of social media and the dynamic it creates, right, wasn't there to exacerbate the thing. Now with regards to hold on, let's check in on the chat. Ramon Terrell says, yeah, I retracted. I assume nobody wants to know what my wife wants for brunch. Okay. Dry Chisel says, it's unfortunate, but this was always going to happen. Whether PS6, PS7, or even PS8, this issue was coming. Even if they reverse course, they'd only be delaying the inevitable as the PlayStation 3 and Vita stores. Or all of the PlayStation 3 and Vita stores. And I'll skip ahead a little bit. In my opinion, they're not reversing this. When you get to this decision and you put this out, this is a thing that you get to having, like, and we've seen news stories now that they're already dismantling their organization that they were having burn the CDs, right, and package and ship them. And those people are all being retrained and redeployed anywhere, right? Quite frankly, one of the things that somebody should give some type of compliment for is thank goodness they're not being laid off. I'm sure maybe some of them are being laid off, but it sounds like, at least from the news copy that we're seeing, is that they're being repurposed. But yeah, I don't think you're reversing course on this because you've been having conversations with other people in downstream components of your supply chain. You've told them that you're pulling this. You're probably coiling yourself up to make additional investments that are needed to convert over to a fully digital distributor. There are agreements, contracts, legal stuff in place that you have to swim through. And you've probably started to have some discussion with developers about what this future means. Like I said, I think that part of this is heavily pinioned to what the PlayStation 6 is going to be, what the PlayStation handheld is going to look like. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I don't think that you walk this back. There's a lot of credence being given to the notion that they're catching all that smoke, right? They're getting insults and they're getting a lot of heat on social media to the point where they've taken a break. And what I point to is they also took a break when they shut down Bluepoint. They took 72 hours off of Twitter, right? That wasn't they didn't take that 72 hours to go to confession, right, in the Catholic Church and sit in the confession box, right, and tell the priest about like all their evils, right, and ask for forgiveness of their sins. They took that 72 hours off because they didn't want to be bothered, right? I believe that their position was, we've made a business decision. People are going to be salty about it. We're moving on. right? I often have this thing in software where I talk about I am not going to have a discussion with a customer about something that I'm not inviting their opinion on. So we have in systems engineering and formal systems engineering, we have these differences, right, between requirements and design. And what we often talk about is that the customer gets inputs on requirements. They get to tell us what it is that they want built. And once they've said that, then it's up to us how we build it. So if you say, I want a red light to come on, roger that. We'll make a red light come on. But we're not necessarily giving you input and inviting you into the design process of how we make that red light turn on, right? Unless you specified it. If you specified exactly how you want to come on, then that's a difference. That's probably a thing that you're going to pay for. But by and large, you get to say what you want a system to do. We get to decide how we go about doing that, because that is what allows us to control costs. That is what drives our labor mix. That is what drives, how many defects we propagate and how we control them, and yada, yada, yada. So one of the things I always say is, again, if it's a design decision, that is probably not something that I'm inviting the customer to have input on, so I'm not going to have that conversation. And I think that's what you're seeing from PlayStation. PlayStation's not inviting your input on this topic. They've made their decision. They're moving on. And again, I go back to what we covered in the first segment, which is now your response is the option to say, okay, I'm going to take my business elsewhere, and you should get about the business of doing that. Okay, so how does this tilt the competitive landscape? What does this do between Xbox and PlayStation? What do we think that PlayStation is thinking about how this thing is going to play out? What I think is, I think they're betting that this will allow them to sail and navigate into the future. And we're going to talk extensively about what is the future of gaming, but especially in the console base. I think the capital base of the people who are buying physical, because remember, I think what's going to happen is that they're going to make this decision and everything is going to become all digital, right, on PlayStation. At that point, the bucket of people who buy physical media are going to decompose and triage into some atomic buckets in terms of response. So I'm taking the sorting hat and putting people into buckets of how they're going to respond. I'm sure that there's a demographic of people who buy both digital and physical who are just going to shrug their shoulders and say, you know what, the choice for physical is being removed, so I'm just going to go all digital. I think part of their thinking is going to be, I was already mostly doing that anyway. I was only occasionally going out of my way to buy something physical. So it's not a big deal. And the other option is being removed. So whatever, but it's not enough. The removal of the option is not enough, right, to drive me to another platform. Then you're going to have some people who are, religiously opposed to the removal of physical. That's the vocal, I won't call them a minority yet, but I think they're a vocal minority. And so they're going to take their business elsewhere, and that's going to be a loss to PlayStation. I also think that, if there's 30,000 people out there claiming that they're going to take their business elsewhere, I think only 15,000 of them are actually going to take their business elsewhere. I think the other 15,000 are just expressing consternation and admittedly frustration and getting it out of their system. And then in a week or two, they're going to come back and say, you know what, I don't like it, but these are the cards that are dealt and I'm going to do it. But anyway, they're going to be some are going to be religiously opposed to the removal of physical, so they're going to take their business elsewhere, and that's going to be a loss to PlayStation. You're also going to have, and I also talk about this with, changes that the human race is exposed to, where, threshold shifts in society, right? Where past generations who were already functioning underneath a certain paradigm, there's a system shock, and then they experience what they're seeing now. And so there's a system shock, and then, we see this thing play out as expressed outrage, right? But the younger generations, the youthful generations who are coming behind them and entering that space, they just grew up thinking that that's just the way things are. So remember, there was a generation of people who grew up with AM, FM radio, right? And then we kind of grew up in a generation, right? Then we had younger generations come along where AM, FM radio, what's that? I can't remember what exactly it was, but somebody asked me the other week, there was some technology that I was referring to. What is that? What are you talking about? Right? So, I often talk about how, I've seen kids who start their television watching with streaming, and then they go and stay in a hotel for their first time. And they say, hey, pause it. I'm going to go use a bathroom. right? And I'm like, this is live TV. There's no pausing, right? You're just going to miss it, right? So that's a system shock to them, right? But but like their normalcy, right? What they're exposed to in the other 90% of their life is like everything's streaming, and you can just pause it. So to them, the notion of live TV is the aberration, right? It's the exception to the rule. And so I think what you're going to have is you're going to have people who are going to grow into this new paradigm where everything from a gaming perspective is digital, and it's not going to bother them, right? So there's going to be some period of time of transition where like people are rubbed the wrong way about it. But like, again, I think the market is going to move on to a new normal. So anyway, the youthful generations that are entering that space, they just grew up thinking that that's just the way things are. So new gamers entering the space because it's highly unlikely that the other primary platform owners are not going to head in this direction as well, right? So Xbox and Nintendo, they're just going to, right? They're going to also transition to probably an all digital future. Those new gamers are just coming in thinking that all digital all the time is the way things naturally are. They're probably at a certain point, they're going to just start thinking that's the way they've always been. It's kind of funny. A content creator talked about, and who's been now proven wrong, it said, we're going to look back and see this age of exclusives and it will be studied, right? As if we were cavemen, right? Doing something like crazy. And again, now that we've had the resurgence of exclusives, we see that that's not going to be the case. Actually, what they're probably going to, I guarantee what they're going to look back is they're going to look back at strangeness and say, you mean things were on physical media? It hasn't been digital the whole time? That's going to be the thing that's going to be strange to them. So yeah, I mean, my analog here is it's just like, there's been different generations of kids who, did not grow up with a microwave in the house. But generations came into being kind of aware as young adults, grew up with the notion that microwaves are just a naturally inherent component within a household, and that's normal. It's a normalized way to prepare food. But I'm sure if you brought somebody from the early 1900s, right, into a house in the 70s or 80s and showed them a microwave, they would think that they were like on the Jetsons, right? But somebody who was younger than that, they would just assume that that's normal. So I think this will become normalized pretty quickly too. Because I think what we're seeing is culturally we are adapting to inflection points in technology a lot faster than previous generations of humans have. So I don't think there's a ton of risk exposure to PlayStation. People feel like this is a big deal, and there's going to be a lot of punishment that's going to be visited on PlayStation. I don't believe that the damage infliction is going to be such that it's not going to be a thing that they will quickly surmount. Sometimes you have to kind of tank and bathtub, right? And then you move forward and move on. We'll talk a little bit about like what growth might look like. Yeah, Thrifty, thanks so much for swinging through. I appreciate you, Mr. Throwback 5. I grew up with arcades and Sega hardware. Yeah, Thrifty, I think that the new normal will have fewer PlayStation owners. And that's possible, Thrifty. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit. It's one of the things that I talk about with gamers is we have to grow into a thing where two things can be true. It is possible that they will have fewer PlayStation owners. It is possible that is inevitable. It's also possible that there will be fewer PlayStation owners of a certain type, and that still will allow the business to go. So we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. I think I talked about this a little bit earlier. Like I said, I don't think there's a ton of risk exposure to PlayStation, not at the scale that other people think there is. The other thing I think is that because there's a lot of conflicted arguments going on around the numbers, right? What is the percentage of games sold on physical versus digital for PlayStation? A lot of conflicting reports, a lot of people choosing to believe one number or the other. Here's a kind of a template, right, that I want to kind of use to talk about it, or just kind of a hypothetical basis of math that I'll lay out. So whether or not you believe one number or the other are ascribed to one set of numbers or the other, let's say it's ecumenical to say that the split is 50-50. So let's say for the purposes of the discussion, let's say 50% of PlayStation sales of new games, of full games, right, not including microtransactions and all the other crazy stuff left or right of that. But let's just talk about games. Let's say 50% on PlayStation sales are digital and 50% are physical. So I'm giving a deference to the argument, right, more than PlayStation has. PlayStation asserts that most of their sales are digital. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, I'll give you 50-50. So let's just say PlayStation sells 1,000 units of software in a year. 500 of those are physical and 500 of those are digital. So in a world where then, in the first drift, you see that number start to change. So let's say that, at a 5-year point, you see, so 10 years ago, right? You say that, hey, the split is shifted now, and the split is now there's 300 on physical and 700 on digital. Right there, you see a reason why they would make the decision that they're making. But then when we talk about this thing of like, people are going to leave the platform, there's going to be less PlayStation owners, there's going to be a backslide. What we don't know, and I think this is actually feasible, right, as we talk about new players coming into the market, is that there's a very high potential that not only was there that drift, but the split didn't become 300 and 700 and 1,000 units sold, right? Because we've seen increasing numbers of unit sales of software each year, right? So what is the basis of our foundational hypothesis of where those additional units sold of software are growing? If those additional units of software of growth of each year are making that formula that there's 300 sold on physical, but it's not 700 sold on digital, it's 900 sold on digital. My point being that the growth is on the digital side. And so that is something that I think has to be considered, because then what you look at and you say, look, what I'm planning on or estimating is that I'm going to shut down physical. Yeah, I'm going to lose some physical sales, but I'm going to continue to see growth on my digital side. I'm not seeing growth in the physical sales of media. And this is one of the critical inflection points that I think you have to consider when you look at the data. And we've talked about this for the last few years, right? We've talked about these contested periods of, we overhired and we overproduced and we thought that there was going to be this COVID area growth for all time. And that hasn't been the case. And we've slowly eked back to single digit percentage growth. And PlayStation has also benefited a lot from the slough off of like the defectors from Xbox, right? But you're probably, within a generation, you're probably bottoming out on that, right? You may not be having a ton more of people coming over from the other side. You'll get another inflection when we go to the generational changeover, depending on what Xbox does. But by and large, like you've bottomed out on the potential of flip over, right, from people coming over from Xbox. So in this world of constrained growth, if you're continuing to see an increase on unit sales of software year over year, there's a good chance that growth is not in the physical space and is not 50-50 in the physical space, but is actually over on the digital side. And so this may be another reason where if you see a declining part of your business, that you may put your bets on the part that's increasing. Let's see. Mr. Starback, I remember you mentioning the weakness of old Sony was that they stayed on the path too long. Certainly aren't doing that now. Yeah, absolutely. 13 says, I myself have already looked at the cost of upgrading my PC instead of putting money towards a PS6. 13 says, most of their sales are digital, but that includes microtransactions, games, and downloadable content. Physical game sales only tracks the game. This is why I feel like Sony is gaslighting. Yeah, that's possible. I mean, I'm not going to disagree with you. I mean, absolutely, the continued revenue growth is on microtransactions. We've heard that from the rest of the industry for years preceding this event. But what I point back to is, I find it would just like mathematically be incongruous to me, make no sense to me whatsoever for all of the publishers, right? EA, Ubisoft, 2K, or Take-Two, Capcom, for all of these publishers to be saying that since 2016, 2017, all of their purchases have been moving, because none of them are platform owners. All of them have been reporting that their sales are moving to digital. So, and we've had the discussion that the vast majority of what gets sold on PlayStation is third party. So it just doesn't track for me that all the third parties are saying that more and more and more and more that their sales are transitioning to digital. But we believe that the split on the platform owner is somehow 50-50 or is more deferential towards physical than digital. That just doesn't track or make sense for me personally. And I'm not throwing shade on what anybody else believes. I'm just saying that my mathematical processing of it and calculations that I'm looking at, like that inference, like doesn't track for me. Okay, so let's shift into, so that's kind of the foundation. Let's shift into the cascade of changes that this is going to bring about, or like what it's in response to, and start formulating the new hypothesis of kind of what the future looks like. So this is a little bit of kind of going back to reset table stakes. So in this segment, we're unpacking a cascade of shifts that could redefine the future of console platforms. First, let's talk about Sony's decision to end physical media by 2028. As I read the news, my immediate thought was that this wasn't shocking. Media like music and video has made this leap long ago, and PC gaming went digital decades back. What caught my eye, though, was the timing. Like I said, it feels like a signal that PlayStation 6 may be closer than we think. As a longtime observer, I believe Sony is betting that this move anchors them in a multi-SKU future. So just like Apple does, just like Samsung has, offering a range from baseline to premium devices, right? So we're starting to talk about the evolution of the console space. And we'll start primarily orienting around PlayStation because nobody knows what the hell Xbox is doing, right? Of them sailing into a multi-SKU future and why they may be making the choices they make. And I mean, and when I talk about multi-SKU future, I'm talking about in a more expansive way than having the PlayStation digital, right, versus the PlayStation base, right, and even the PlayStation 5 Pro. So yes, like as we've talked about, the cost around these consoles will rise. They are rising. Consoles will be more expensive. But by keeping the PlayStation 5 in production, Sony's lengthening the life cycle and reaching a broader set of price points. What we have seen before in this generation is that people have been very sluggish to transition from last gen to this gen. I don't personally hold on to an hypothesis that that changes in the next generation because that, again, doesn't make any sense to me. It's incongruous. It doesn't track. What I would expect and anticipate is that that dynamic will be more pervasive next generation, right? That you're going to have, right? We keep saying that there's still legs left in the PlayStation 5, that all the potential hasn't been realized. So if that is the case, it's highly unlikely more people, that's going to be different. We're going to have a different outcome next generation than we've had last. We're probably going to have people who are even more sluggish to move off PlayStation 5 to PlayStation 6. So I think the PlayStation 5 remains in production. I think the life cycle that we're going to see for the PlayStation 5 is not 7 years, as it has normally been, meaning when we've transitioned generations before, we have typically stopped production of the last console. But one of the things I pointed, and I'm not talking about like let's do this 1 million unit breakup sex run that we did at the PlayStation 4, right? I'm talking about the planned intentionality being of next generation, that we are going to produce both the PlayStation 6 and the PlayStation 5, and that the PlayStation 5 may map to a generational life cycle across 2 generations. Because I think you're going to have to. So now I've heard a lot of people cry out, delay the consoles, don't launch them, they're too expensive. But what I keep saying is the economic landscape has already changed. The middle class is shrinking. Discretionary income is becoming more concentrated in the upper income bands. So yes, it's already preordained in my mind that the PlayStation 6 will sell to a lower install base. Already in my mind, the PlayStation 6 will probably be the lowest selling generation, right, in that encapsulation of as the primary console of the 7-year duration. It's already preordained that that's going to be the lowest selling PlayStation in the modern console era. That's already baked in. As a business, Sony needs to make that console to spark the next hardware cycle, right? So I don't think they can delay it, even though it's going to sell to the smallest base. And the reason why is because they need to incentivize and kick off the next round of people buying hardware, even if the total number of people buying hardware is less. Because it, again, makes no sense to me that you've got this sluggishness and this lag of people buying PlayStation 5s, which is only going to increase. The longer the console is on the market, you're going to continue to have fewer and fewer people buying it, particularly at the inflated prices, the increased prices. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, why that changes and why that makes it okay to buy to deploy the PlayStation 6. But crucially, they're not just abandoning the PlayStation 5, they'll keep it around. So those that can afford the next gen can still access well, what I mean by that is there will people, they're going to keep it around. And the critical important thing of that is they will continue making software for that console across the entirety of the next generation. And so that transitions them into a much more so than this generation, into a multi-generational platform owner and software provider. There's not going to be children left behind, right, effect in the next console generation. And so the people who can't afford the PlayStation 6, that's okay, because you'll be able to afford the PlayStation 5, and that's really okay. The difference when Don Matrix said that is he said, if you can't afford the Xbox One, we have a console for you. It's the Xbox 360. And more so, if you don't like having your console always online, we have a console that you can play offline. It's the Xbox 360. But the difference was, at the time, what codified our thinking was that new software is not going to continue to be produced for the Xbox 360. New games were not going to continue to come to the Xbox 360. New games will continue to come to the PlayStation 5. Then we look at Xbox, right? Reportedly testing digital features that lets players digitize physical games. And so if they do this, both giants will be heading towards an all digital reality. And that is going to be a significant change in the landscape. So as I talk about PlayStation, I think one of their big things I foresee is their future state being here in the Generation 10 of consoles, where they're going to have, like I said, multiple hardware SKUs deployed across their user base. So just like Nintendo is continuing to continuing to produce and sell the Nintendo Switch, even though they've deployed the Switch 2, I expect the PlayStation 5 to continue into production. And so, not just like the, like I said, not just like the one single manufacturer, 1 million units. I actually expect this generation to continue making the PlayStation 5. So I think the PlayStation 5 is actually going to have a total life cycle of maybe 14 years. And that'll be continued across console generation 9 and into console generation 10, because this console generation, they had a huge problem. I think I talked about a little bit of this before. Both Xbox and PlayStation have a very big problem getting users to see the value in upgrading, so I don't know why anyone think that this is going to change in the next generation, become exacerbated. They're going to have to build the PlayStation 6. I know I'm crossing over some of this stuff redundancy because there was a blip. Sorry, when I was making the file with the script. So, and then, and part of this makes they may still have the PlayStation 5 Pro going as well. And then we have indications that you're going to have this PlayStation 6 handheld. So that's your fourth SKU. So I also haven't totally taken off the table that they will not deploy some variant of the PlayStation 6, that we may get an early PlayStation 6 Pro at the beginning of the generation, or that there may not be this lower power PlayStation 6, or something that is like a set-top version of the PlayStation 6 handheld. So if you remember back to the PlayStation Portable, there was a SKU that they made which didn't include the screen, but which was the set-top box, like very small form factor, that was essentially a PlayStation Portable, but that hooked up to your TV directly. So there's talk of the PlayStation 6 handheld being something that is dockable. I think it's also potential that they'll just make a set-top box version of it. And then they may pull one of the PlayStation 5 SKUs out of rotation. So like they may pull the base with the right where you can add on the disk drive out of rotation. It may just be the PlayStation 5 digital and the PlayStation 5 Pro. I don't know. But my point is I think next generation is going to start to look very much like the Apple portfolio of devices, where you have multiple levels of devices being deployed across similar product categories to hit at different price points. So I think the challenge for PlayStation is going to be how to make software for all of these different hardware SKUs. I think we've seen indications of that this is this low power setting that we've heard of and that we've seen being developed and put in the SDK. I think it would be great if, for developers that you're able to simply say, if you detect this hardware, run this game in low power mode. Which again, I think is some indications and warnings that we've seen of how it's going to work. And I think that's going to become more critical in the next generation because you're going to, I think this may propagate because you may have multiple low power modes, right? Right now, we have this notion that there's a full power mode, for lack of a better term, and one low power mode. You may have more. I think at a minimum, you're going to have operational profiles that the devs have to orient around for hardware optimization, because you're going to have a high-end SKU, a tier 2 SKU, a tier 3 SKU, and then like the handheld, right? So you're going to have to start orienting around. You're not just going to have a switch you're going to flip, but you're going to have to actually have operational profiles, because the span is going to be more than just binary about how a game performs on these different hardware sets. So the analog is this is similar to the iOS capability, where you build your app once and then, there's stuff in the SDK that allows the app to detect, am I deployed on an iPhone? Am I deployed on an iPad? Oh, I'm deployed on an iPad. Let's go ahead and run in the tablet UI instead of the phone UI. And then there are performance hooks in there as well. So I think that's going to be part of the challenge, at least for PlayStation going forward, and how I think they're maybe going to contend with that. I think part of the reason they're going to have to do that is because we've got the rising cost issue, right? So the PlayStation 6 will be expensive. I don't personally think that it's going to be $1,000. Maybe it will be. Let's just say it is. But I think, optimally what they want to do is they want to price, whatever the price the PlayStation 6 is, and this is the same thing I said about the Steam Machine, they're going to want to create some space between that and the PlayStation 5s. Because the Apple problem that Apple always talks about is how if we have SKUs that hit at different performance levels, but those SKUs are priced without enough span between the next higher tier, then we start to get cannibalization, right, across that span of stack. So whatever you put the PlayStation 6 at, I think you have to create space between whatever is your next SKU, and that may drive which of the PlayStation 5 SKUs they keep on the market, right? Whichever one gives them that spacing between however much the PlayStation 6 costs. Obviously, the more the PlayStation 6 costs, kind of the more headroom you have to play with which SKU you keep. That's not necessarily a good thing for consumers, but that's part of how I think the math will stack. What does this space look like in terms of like the gaming community, and how we talk about, right, going back to like the PlayStation physical thing? I think a lot of Twitter and YouTube right now is oriented around fomenting outrage, right? And this is kind of what Forte said. I don't necessarily line up entirely to what Forte was talking about last night on DPS. I think Forte's main thing was he was frustrated with the content creators who are kind of fomenting this outrage, particularly when he knows some of these content creators are not really in a space where they have the causality to be outraged, right? Because he knows that they play predominantly digitally. I'm not going to get into like who he knows or who he doesn't know or how much he knows about person, but like, we've look at a dirty, nasty, dirty laundry secret right amongst this whole ring of like content creators and stuff is like you have a lot of Xbox mains and PlayStation mains who actually have the other console, but they'll never talk about that on air, right? And they actually spend significant time playing on the other console, but they'll never talk about that on air because that's like some faux pas of behavior or whatever. But there's a lot of commiserating with, even though they don't have causality to be mad, right? Being mad along with other people, because it's good for business. For me personally, I can't be that. So the reason I'm not on the podcast today, like outraged about Sony going physical, is it doesn't impact me. I made the transition to digital for almost everything years ago, like 20 years ago for music, 10 years ago for video. And my own experience this generation has been at the beginning of this generation. I did buy some physical, but like literally I had to, I would have to write a Post-it note, right, and put it in my car, like leave it on the dashboard saying, hey, remember to stop by GameStop on your way home, because my natural predilection was it's much preferable for me. Like if I get up and a new game is launching and I know I want to be able to play it when I go home, it's quite preferential for me to either queue that up on the console, like as I'm getting ready for work before I leave, or do it on the app, right? It's one of the great things to like be able to call up the thing on the app, pay for it on the app, and start, know that the download is starting. So, but again, when I talk about the archetype of consumer I am, the two big examples I point to is, and I love my father-in-law. My father-in-law is the type of person who will drive to the other side of town because he knows that the gas over there is 5 cents less than the guy on the corner, and maybe not him, but, other people who are this, they might express outrage at the guy, 5 blocks down the street who's got his gas price to that's just not me. Like I just go get the gas. Like, and a lot of that has to do with price sensitivity and price elasticity and stuff like that. I am also the type of consumer where like, look, I love going to bookstores, but like if your bookstore has like shitty parking and is in a bad, a part of town where it's like inconvenient, I hate the traffic, I'm not going to go to the bookstore. I'll just go to Amazon and buy and order the book. That's just me. So like, and again, I'm not casting aspersions on people who are built differently. What I'm saying is I can't sit here on a podcast in front of you and act outraged about something that I'm not outraged about because it doesn't impact me. So, you know, I think, you know, as a content creator, YouTubers, Twitter, whatever, everybody's got to make that choice and everybody's got to decide what they're going to do. The one thing I don't give a lot of credence to is, you know, the article that I talked about at the beginning, which is that, you know, game developers are saying, you know, there's this notion that, like, I think the games media kind of pounced on those comments by a few developers and extrapolated them to, like, the headline said, you know, developers are outraged that Sony's going for this. I don't know that developers are outraged. Game developers are trying to navigate this evolving landscape as well. One of the things that's strange to me is, like I said, you know, this claim that everybody, all of them are unhappy. And I'm like, really? Are we sure that's not an anecdotal slice of like one or two devs who said something? Because telling developers that they no longer have to be concerned about cramming their game onto a 100 gigabyte Blu-ray and being freed from the constraint, and just being able to, like, in a world where we have things like Call of Duty. And, you know, one of those things in those dynamics is we often act like it's only Call of Duty, right? It's not only Call of Duty. It's Halo Infinite. It's Forza Horizon. It's Flight Simulator. There's tons of games out there that are 150 gigabyte games. And I know I just rattled off a bunch of Xbox games, so there's more than just Xbox games. There's tons of games these days in the AAA space that are 150 gigs. And they're not necessarily going to fit on a disc. And I've seen this thing of like, well, you pack in multiple discs. You know, I mean, again, I think things are going to be framed by your experience, but like one of the experiences that sticks with me is that I think in the conversion over to DVD, I think one of the last games, and DVDs were actually available. It's just, I think it was Warner Brothers, like, didn't make the transit, like, so they elected to ship, I think it was a Lord of the Rings RTS, and they elected to ship it on CDs. Even though DVDs were available, they were just sticking with their plan. Well, what their plan resulted in was this thing came on 9 CDs. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. So I don't particularly think, like, as a consumer, I don't want to be bothered with multiple, like, discs in a case. That's just me. And even when these things are going on disc, like it's 50 gigabytes on the disc, 100 gigabytes on the disc, and then after you put the thing in and it goes through this lengthy install of the disc onto the thing, then it's still got to pull out like a 50 gigabyte like remainder of the game or a 10 gigabyte patch or whatever. So I don't necessarily know that I believe like the entirety of the development community who has to code and manage to all that, right? Configuration manage to all that. That I just don't believe that the majority of the development community is incensed that PlayStation isn't doing physical anymore. I think that there's a lot of developers who are going to see that that constraint is being lifted and they no longer have to be hung up about it. They no longer have to put like development LOE against that. We constantly hear about the Nintendo developers, people developing games for Nintendo who have to, constantly come up with tactics to manage how they get their game on one of these cards. And in fact, we know that's part of the reason that Nintendo went to GameKey cards so that the developers could still sell something physical in stores, but wouldn't have to be hung up with the overhead constraint of the storage capacity. I don't know why my dog is barking. Probably something. It's not me. Hopefully he'll stop. But the other thing that we've heard is like the developers have to buy the cards themselves, so that's a cost to them. And the larger capacity of the card, the increase the cost is to devs. So I think the notion that, like I said, the whole development community or the majority of the development community in aggregate is incensed by this decision is a load of BS. I personally don't think that's the case. I think developers would now be free to make their PlayStation games as large as they want. I also don't necessarily think that's a good thing. I don't think we need a propagation of more 150 gigabyte games because they're a pain in the butt. But I just don't buy that the entire development community is incensed. Yeah, hold on. I'm going to try and get my dog to settle down just a bit. Okay, usually he responds to me. He's shouting at him to quiet down, so we'll see. Okay, so a little bit about what I think this is going to, again, like how this is going to flower out in the future. So we're moving to an all digital future, right? And then we have this knit of where all this stuff is going to be walled garden encased in one store. I don't think that that's going to be allowed to pervade. I think that what this is going to incite and what these platform owners will now trip across is the fact that there's lots of legal movement that says once you stand your store up and you have benefited from 30% cut, right, in the with some longevity of being the only provider of software to a platform, after that, so there's some grace for that to pervade for some period of time, but like then you have to open it up. And they're forcing these stores open. They're doing that with the Google Play Store. They're doing that with the App Store. It's a slow and painful process because Apple and Google are giants. Apple is playing a lot of shenanigans about saying, yeah, got it, roger that, no problem. We will open the store up. Devs, here's the draconian regime under which you can pop up a store outside the App Store. There's all types of baggage associated with it. But at the end of the day, I think they're going to wind up having to force the stores open. So my point of like this new future where I talk about the end of platforms. So again, let's go through what we've built up to date. I think you're going to see a PlayStation that has to deploy multiple hardware SKUs. So you've got 4, 5 SKUs out there. You're selling everything digital. And so initially you're starting with everything coming through your store. But then the justice systems come along, right? The commissions, the EC, the CMA, and they say, no, you can't do that. You got to open this stuff up. I think what we're seeing is the initial seeds of that with these monopoly cases that are being filed against PlayStation. I think you're going to see that expand, flower out, exacerbate, rankle feathers, get people spooled up in the legal system. And so I think these stores are going to be cracked open. And I think you're going to go to a future where there are games that can be provisioned by the store. Because I think people are going to start asking, look, you're selling everything digitally. Why are you preventing Ubisoft or Activision or Blizzard or Capcom? Why can't they now sell the game directly to a PlayStation consumer? Why does the PlayStation consumer have to come through you? Because at a certain point, this enablement of this implementation, this deployment of these technologies, those types of things stop making sense. So, like, again, PlayStation's going to have to struggle with that challenge and contend with it because obviously, as I've been saying, the crown jewel these days is your digital storefront. The reason the hardware is important is because it is the access point for your digital storefront. What happens when that doesn't become the only access point or where there can be multiple digital stores on a platform, that starts to change the fabric. And so if you want, like, that is an area where we can say by going to a non-physical future, you open up that competitive challenge and that competitive avenue, and that increases your challenges. I don't necessarily know that I ascribe to the notion that it results in a net reduction in revenue for the PlayStation business, but it certainly creates new challenges, new competition, things they're going to have to come up with and decide how to manage. It probably initially, at certain stages in the evolution is definitely a setback. And then they've got to figure out, right, how to deal with that. For me personally, I would not personally partake of that. Even when I talk about mobile, and Thrifty mentions that's a good point. Thanks a lot, Thrifty. I appreciate it. Even on mobile, hold on, let me catch up with this one coming. It says, Thrifty says, and just buy the digital code for the PlayStation game. Yeah. I mean, that's what, like, Steam is a storefront, but like you can go buy a Steam code through another vendor, right? And then go into Steam and like redeem it. So I think those questions are going to start being asked. For me personally, I'm not doing that. Lots of people talk about on PC how there's all these different like Green Man Gaming and you can go buy the Steam code from Amazon. Just for me personally, I don't do that. Like if I'm gonna be a Steam player, which is still an unusual label, right, for me to use. I think a lot of people who are not on Steam like have been co-opting that term. Whatever. I'm just gonna buy my stuff from Steam. Like it's got to become painful enough for me to not want to do that before that becomes a big deal for me, so I don't do it. And in this work, for me personally as a consumer, even though I've presented that as a hypothesis, right? So now you're on a PlayStation 6. It's like you can buy stuff from PlayStation or directly from Ubisoft or directly from Capcom, and those types of things I will do. Like on PC, I will say because I'm an Ubisoft stan, right? I will say, hey, I want Ubisoft to get all the money. I don't want them to give I don't want them to have to give a 30% cut to Steam. I am not religiously motivated by that. Like, I don't do it every single time. But like Assassin's Creed, when I went and bought Assassin's Creed, yeah, I bought it directly through the Ubisoft launcher because I was like, hey, Ubisoft needs the help. Like, I like what they're doing. They're continuing to make the games that I want. I'm gonna do them a solid by, paying them all the money directly to them. But then from a security standpoint, when we talk about like smaller third-party vendors or third-party vendors that like I don't want to give deference to, I personally like getting my stuff through the secure transfer point and, being able to hold them accountable for, managing that. I like things to be curated and sanitized and like have a certification process, know that there's some guardrails in place to keep it from being the wild, wild west. And so, yeah, even with the publisher stores, I also have the confidence. I guess what I'm saying, like, is look, if Green Man Gaming pops up a PlayStation store, I'm not buying from Green Man Gaming, right? That gets me too far, right, outside the guardrails. So that I'm not going to do. But at the end of the day, I think it's overall healthier on the supplier side and increases competition if those stores are forced open. And so consumers have different supply paths from which to procure digital games. So if you hate me because I don't have a problem with physical going away, maybe at least you'll give me points for being okay with further competition on digital storefronts. So we talked about delaying the consoles. Like I said, lots of people are saying delay them. I don't. And here's my thing is I don't think it makes sense for the platform owners, but in particular, I don't think it's going to have the effect that you think it's going to have. Like, thinking that delaying the consoles will somehow lead to more of the current generation consoles being sold, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think people are going to continue to buy PlayStation 5s in droves or PlayStation 5 Pros in droves at $900 or $750 or whatever it is for the other SKUs. Yes, we're going to get a bump from GTA 6, but the GTA 6 like retail tail, I don't think continues to propel the industry forward in perpetuity. I think, for the businesses, they have to move on to the next console. I don't think it has the outcome that you think it's going to have by the delay. Yeah, so again, those next generation consoles, I think they're going to sell to an install base. I don't think you're going to sell 90 million or 100 million PlayStation 6s, not in a 7-year life cycle. You may sell that many by the time you're moving into the 14-year life cycle. But again, this dynamic of people who haven't moved to the next generation is only going to exacerbate. And so that means that the sell-through of the next generation is going to be less than the previous generation. The reason that will be okay, like I said, is because they have multiple SKUs. You're going to continue to make the PlayStation 5. You're going to see extended total life cycles of hardware. So this whole notion that you shouldn't make the PlayStation 6 because you're not going to sell as many, you're already not going to sell as many. That's already preordained. And so that shouldn't be looked at as a gate to when the PlayStation 6 will come out. What I keep going back to is, well, you as the consumer may say, you don't need the PlayStation 6. I think PlayStation needs the PlayStation 6 as a business. You're not going to get a bump getting you back to your normal revenue trajectory on the old hardware because there's already a chilling effect, a dampening effect of the uptake of hardware because it's now been deployed and on the market for 6 years. And I mean this like quadruple times for Xbox, right? You're not going to get people to buy new Xboxes with the Series X having been on the market for 6 years when it's already been, breathing smoke, coughing up a lung this entire time. And so I don't think that the corporations are going to let that status quo remain because it just doesn't make sense. Better to deploy it on time, move, transition in this evolution of the console industry as a whole. Where the PlayStation 6 is on the market, you have the PlayStation 5 on the market, you have the 6 handheld, these other SKUs. So I think, unless I screwed up copying my script, I think that covers like a lot of the, I'm going to try and go back to where I kind of formulated this hypothesis and make sure that it's covered everything. So again, why are we potentially going to see the end of platform owners as we know them? And I think this is where I'm going to kind of try and stick the landing on this and land the plane. The Germans talk shit. So I've talked you through the hardware reason, right? Why we're going to see this multi-generational SKUs on the market at the same time, even from one singular vendor. So I'm kind of focusing and harping on PlayStation as kind of the template and the example. Rising costs of hardware, right? Maybe not at $1,000, but you're certainly not going to see a $500 console. You're definitely going to see at least a $650 or above as the new normal. I think then to create space, you're probably going to have to bump that PlayStation 6 up again. So it's definitely going to be up close to $1,000. Then you're going to need to have something that's a cut below that at the $650, $700 level, and maybe a cut below that right down at the $500 level with the handheld. I talked about how that's going to start to push you towards performance profiles. So we have this low power setting, but I think now that so you're talking about, let's just take Intergalactic, right? You're going to throw out Intergalactic, and you're going to have it run on PlayStation 6, PlayStation 5, and PlayStation 6 handheld, and you probably got a SKU somewhere there in between. You're going to have performance profiles to optimize around, so that because you're deploying this game, you're going to have console players who constantly insist that they don't want to monkey around with a lot of settings like you do on PC, and so you're going to have it deploy with just performance and quality mode, let's say, to start. And so that what a performance mode is and quality mode is means a different thing on the PlayStation 6 versus the PlayStation 5 Pro versus the PlayStation 5 Digital. Well, between the 5 Pro and the 5 Digital, and means something different yet again for the PlayStation 6 handheld. So it's the same game, but it's running with 4 different operational profiles. Now let's talk about how in this generation we have included a few more bells and whistles for console players to monkey with to change that experience. And so, yes, we have that performance and quality mode, right, to make it like push button easy for the console players who don't want to be bothered. But we've included a handful of other things in there for other people, right, to deal with who do want to get in there and tinker a little bit. First of all, we have different resolutions that you can run at, and like one of the easiest, quickest ways to change your frame rate output, right, is to monkey with the resolution. But we also have slight other hooks in there. Like maybe we allow you to flip motion blur on and off. Maybe we allow you to mess with ambient occlusion or chromatic aberration, or showing, very obviously you have variable rate shaders, VRR, right, all these other things. And so you've got additional dials and levers and switches that you have even with these operational profiles. So you start to build towards a complexity where you have something that is above the floor of just having performance and quality mode. Let's advance that forward into the evolution, right? Let's go mid-gen. Now you're in mid-gen, maybe you're introducing yet another SKU. Probably are introducing another SKU at mid-gen. Now your complexity of what originally started as 4 performance profiles starts to get more complex. Starts to compound because you're giving people additional bells and whistles. You have a split hardware SKU. So what is your landscape starting to look at? It's starting to close the gap on what consoles look like with PCs. And I'm not down this rabbit hole of like this, what I think is this BS assertion of, all consoles are PCs. Consoles are still going to be largely appliances, largely set-top boxes. But you're starting to invite an operational modality in these things that starts to make less difference, right, where that gap is smushed between full-blown PC complexity and what a console is. Then you have the economic factor of how these digital storefronts are going to be forced open, and you're going to have multiple people who have the ability to push digital content to a console. Who you are as a platform owner in that environment, in that space, is radically different than who you are as a platform owner now, where you're essentially all working within a walled garden. And even Xbox, even for all of the altruism that's heaped on Xbox about how open they are and flexible, that is still largely a walled system where things are sandboxed on the console. But in this world where you start to break these things down and you invite higher complexity and more open storefronts, you start to change the operational and the programmatic and the business lean aspect of a lot of things that are being done. That makes it more similar to the dynamics of the PC space. That causes you to behave differently. That causes you to have different KPIs. That causes you to have different OKRs, different strategy. It causes a different outlook in how you are sourcing components and how you build vendor partnerships. Who's building your hardware? Who's shipping your hardware? All of that stuff starts to change. Some of it starts to look like you exercising less control because what your relationship with Ubisoft, when Ubisoft can push their digital game where people can go to Ubisoft and buy their game, what that implementation looks like on the console. Like I've said, what I expect on the Xbox thing is like that. Let's just say Steam is on Xbox, and I don't know that it's going to be, but let's just say another digital storefront is on Xbox and you have access to that content. What I believe is you're gonna launch, and today it's gonna look just like an Xbox, and you're gonna have an app tile that says Epic Game Store, and you're gonna launch that. It's gonna launch you into a Windows 11 sandboxed environment, and you're gonna have access to your Epic content. I think that is maybe what things start to look like on the PlayStation 6 with regards to other vendors. And again, I'm not saying PlayStation 6 is going to open itself up to Steam and Epic. But I am talking about the publishers, where they may get forced to allow Ubisoft, like I said, because I'm familiar with the Ubisoft launcher. Quite frankly, I don't know. I guess EA has its own launcher and storefront that you can access stuff through on PC. That type of stuff, I think, is going to be a breakdown and allowed. And I think, again, who you are as a platform owner, PlayStation as a platform owner does not look like it does in 2025, 2026. I think it looks radically different. And I think that starts us on the slippery slope. I've talked about, a lot of people prognosticate about like the end of consoles and all that kind of stuff. I've said people are way premature, but I have said, I think in 3 console generations, you will be at a point where there's a cataclysmic shift and things start to look different. Things need to look different. I also can join that with the notion that the disruptive technology that we think the console industry is not going to be done by the things that we see now. It's going to be done, but it's going to be undone by the thing that we can't see, haven't seen yet. It's going to be undone by a disruptive technology. Maybe it would be the holodeck. I don't know. That's the analogy that I always use. Right? But I don't think it's around the corner. I don't think it's next generation. I think it's 3 generations from now. I think you've got 2 more 7-year cycles of generational console hardware. And I think in the 3rd generation, maybe midway through, you start seeing that disruptive technology that by the 4th console generation really kind of rips the fabric off of the way everything goes. And maybe that's just an increasing rate exacerbation of something that we're already seeing. I don't know. Maybe the Steam machine becomes like a really competitive thing. I don't think it is. I think it's going to be a new technology. But I think along that travel and along that evolution, like I said, we're going to see the end of platform owners in the dynamic and in the behavior in how they act upon the marketplace fabric in the way that they do now because of these other changes that I've outlined across hardware, across software development, and across storefronts. I think that's it. Let's see. Okay. So I think that's it. So thanks a lot for everybody who joined in on kind of this special midday edition of the Games Memo. I appreciate you guys stopping through. Rachy, Thrifty. Oh, geez. I guess the mouse isn't going to move when I'm not touching the mouse pad. Ramon Terrell, Dried Chisel, I appreciate you guys stopping through. For anybody who happens to swing through and watch the archive version of this VOD on the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, I appreciate you as well. Please feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can just receive a notification whenever I post new content. I will be back sometime next week. I typically just pop up on a random day during the week, so keep your eye out on the front page of the YouTube channel or on my Blue Sky account for alerts on when the next episode of the Games Memo will be live. And please feel free to come by and join me. Fingers crossed that, never mind. I was about to say fingers crossed that next week will be a less crazy and insane news cycle, but it won't be, because whatever's going to happen at Xbox, I think is going to start happening. I think those bowels are going to start moving next week. Because they need time to put stuff in place and put stuff in action before their earnings call at the end of the month, and their fiscal year is now ended at the end of June. And Ramon says, planning to head to Japan today. Oh, he's asking me about Forza. I was like, what? What is he talking about? Don't Spencer say it's on Gold Gundam models. Yeah, we'll see. I'll hit you up in the Blue Sky DMs to see if we're gonna get together and put some Forza together this weekend. But until next time, take care of yourselves. Stay safe out there. Play the games that you like. Come here to talk to me about the games that you love. Once again, my name has been Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube. One of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going weekly video games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube. That show, we will be live this Sunday. We are not taking off for the 4th of July weekend. It seems like everybody thinks they will be through their festivities and be able to hang out on Sunday night. So that show will be live at the regular time at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on the E2KG Network podcasting channel. Thanks a lot, Ramon. I believe that's what will happen. I just remember that Tao said he's got a baseball tournament and won't be able to make it. So, but DBQ and I are planning on being there. So I think things will be fine. So next week, like I said, I think next week will be just as crazy. If I go early in the week, I may miss all that activity. So we'll see how it goes. But once again, thank you guys for swinging through. I appreciate you. Until next time, good night, good luck, and good gaming. That's going to do it for me. I'm out of here.
I just wanna lie. Yeah. Not a little bit, nah. Who did it? I just wanna lie. 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 Wobble up the spot, no dance, not drunk, cause money in my pants. I just wanna lie. Sip a drink and it got me in a trance. Take the money, baby, I don't wanna dance. I just wanna lie. Got a salary up in my cargo. Push one button, make the car go. Bet I've been a man since top speed. Best kept secret, but it's time I need a spot. I just wanna lie.